Hi, folks. Today we're talking about Chapter 8, Latinx. And when we think of the Latinx population, we can think of terms formerly and at times currently associated with it as well, such as Latino, Latina, as well as Hispanic. And so, in the evolution and social change concerning racial and ethnic groups, there often are efforts and desires to refine and to ultimately kind of make labels more inclusive, less harmful, and more authentic. And so Latinx is exemplary of that. For instance, to have a label for the group and for the demographics therein that is meant to be, again, much more inclusive and not proffering of one particular gender or one particular kind of gender dynamic within the community. So you can think of Latinx as a pan-ethnic label meant to replace Latino and Latina as a, again, gender-neutral inclusive term for persons of Spanish-speaking descent here in the United States. So although this Latinx category is intended as a multiracial ethnic identity and not purely solely a one racial one, more recent research shows, and this is from Parker Horowitz, Marin, and Lopez, it finds that for some Latinx it's regarded largely as ethnic and racial for folks who are of Latinx descent presently. Roughly 63 million people, or 19%, almost 20% of the US population, is Latinx, with Mexican Americans making up the largest share of the Latinx population at roughly 38 million, followed by Puerto Ricans at roughly 6 million and Cuban Americans at roughly 2.5 million persons. Latinx social history, if we talk about that, largely Latinx social history is grounded in mid-19th century efforts to secure Mexican territories for the United States as a result of the Battle of San Jacinto, the Mexican-American War, and the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. In a pattern similar to what we saw with respect to U.S. government treatment of Native Americans, rights supposedly granted to formerly Mexican, now U.S. citizens via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo were not honored. These lack of honored situations, if you will, resulted for Mexican American citizens in land loss, loss of social status, and heritage, as these new citizens were viewed as a source of cheap labor. Going on, Mexican migration to the United States increased significantly in the early 20th century in response to the growing need for farm labor, and this migration was often cyclical and revolving in nature as it is today, reflecting the changing political economy and the changing political economic climate facing Mexican immigrants. Some U.S. government-sponsored programs of the 1900s, such as the Bracero program, favored the migration of Mexican laborers to the United States for agricultural work, while others targeted those who, quote-unquote, looked Mexican for deportation back to Mexico. And we're actually seeing that happen at the state level in the state of Texas, wherein there are efforts in place to make that a legal strategy, wherein if someone is suspected of being an illegal immigrant, that they could easily be placed under some kind of corrective action or arrest. Turning now to Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans, Puerto Ricans became U.S. citizens per the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, with waves of migration to the United States mainland occurring throughout the 1900s in response to favorable economic conditions for such. So again, think about those push and pull factors we talk about, push factors from the island itself and then pull factors from the mainland, pulling folks from the island over the years. So we're now seeing a lot of Puerto Rican migration from, again, the island to the mainland, largely going to states like Florida and Texas. Cuban immigration to the U.S. occurred largely after the rise of Fidel Castro in Cuba in 1959. Wealthy, educated Cubans fled Cuba as political refugees to the United States in response to the prospect of having their assets seized by the new communist government in Cuba. Now, in terms of intergroup relations throughout American history, the Latinx population, its relationship to the dominant white society and government spanned the entire range of intergroup relations. From extermination to pluralism, with U.S. government dominance initially established through experiences of annexation and conquest, genocide, lynching, expulsion, as well as forced repatriation and segregation. And so we'll go through a few examples of these. Now, in terms of annexation, we're looking really here at this case for the Latinx population, where the vast majority of the southwestern United States was gained through conquest and war by the mid 1800s. Also, lynching, at least according to documented social history, at least hundreds of lynchings, so torture based murders, that we also saw, if you will, in the experience of African American history. So, these torture based murders of Mexican Americans, hundreds of these took place between the mid 1800s through the 1920s throughout the Southwest, a period of quote unquote unparalleled danger from mob violence for Mexican Americans, according to Kerrigan and Webb. And we're really looking at perhaps those lynchings having been numbered in the thousands. So we're looking at, again, what they conservatively estimate in terms of the lynching pattern for Mexican Americans from, again, the mid 1800s through the 1920s. So again, you're looking at several decades. So what we found and what we can say is that the hundreds are that which we can document, but more than likely, given the span of time, there were much, much more. Going on in terms of intergroup relations, expulsion was also an experience wherein we saw much of this directed towards the Mexican American population. Although immigration to the U.S. was largely unrestricted for Mexicans between the late 1800s and early 1900s, so a lot of this was to support farming, mining, general agriculture, and railroads. The Great Depression of the 30s made things different. That was a period of strong anti-Mexican sentiment, resulting in forced removal of both Mexican citizens and Mexican Americans. And so the changing economic and cultural circumstances therein made Mexicans often and Mexican Americans targets or scapegoats for what was seen as social ills plaguing the U.S. economy and the country itself. In terms of segregation, Mexican Americans attended largely segregated quote unquote Mexican schools, for instance, throughout California through the 1940s until this practice was struck down by the U.S. District Court in Mendez versus Westminster. So this actually became precedent for ending school segregation for African Americans via Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka just 7 years later in 1954. In terms of social class, gender, and race, we can look in terms of gender at noted wage gaps. For Latinx men and women, they make a fraction of their white counterparts, earning on average 68% and 58% of white men and women's wages, respectively, even when we compare whites and Latinx of similar education. And so, again, racial discrimination is what explains that gap. Data also indicate that Latinx persons suffered greater unemployment rates during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well, for instance, as Latinx persons are disproportionately employed in service occupations, where social distancing was not a likely response. Going on, Latinx workers are more likely to experience wage discrimination in the form of labor law violations. According to the work of Milkman, Gonzalez, and Narrow, Latinx populations have a long history of racial classification that dates back to Spanish colonization, involving so-called racial mixing of the Spanish, indigenous populations, and African populations, leading to a color and class stratification system and colorism. And we saw this also with African Americans, where those who are lighter, who have supposedly more European features, physically they were favored socially over those who had indigenous and African features. Preference for white features is found throughout mainstream Latinx culture, in institutional leadership, social class, and the media and pop culture. In terms of institutions, Latinx families, for instance, are often characterized by the norm of familism, where group and social norms that occur emphasize greater importance of family needs and values ahead of the individual's interest. And so there is a continuum of all of this sort or these kinds of identification within a family context. And so if you're looking within certain cultures, particularly Latinx culture and Asian American cultures, you're more likely to see a greater emphasis on the good of the whole, more collectivism, than what is good for the individual. So this context within the family also involves emotional support, caring for youth as well as the elderly, and the social support of family networks. These norms are also consistent with lower rates of divorce and cohabitation amongst Latinx families. However, over generations, successive generations, familism declines. In terms of the economy, inequality in household incomes between white and Latinx families has increased since 1970, and that's consistent with the decline of unions, the shift from manufacturing to services, globalization in general, technological change, and deregulation. While differences in education between white and Latinx workers explain some of these household income inequalities, differences within the same level of education point to racism as the cause. And again, just like we had seen and said before in other aspects of wealth and income. In terms of health, Latinx families and Latinx Americans are often less likely to have health insurance, and more than 1/3 of the foreign born Latinx lack health insurance. Generally, Latinx persons have worse health outcomes than other U.S. counterparts and cite the workplace as a factor in health declines and challenges, and that's according to the research from Pew Research Center. All right, in terms of politics, in response to significant growth in the Latinx population during the 90s, political organizations such as the National Council of La Raza, they have begun to increase both voter registration and turnout in Latinx communities. The research indicates that Cubans are significantly more likely than other Latinx groups to vote Republican. In terms of immigration, research from Light, He, and Roby finds that the undocumented have substantially lower crime rates than native-born citizens and legal immigrants across a range of felony offenses. So this reality contradicts the often cited stereotype of Latinx folks as criminals. Education, according to the Pew Research Center, approximately 60% of the entire Latinx population, the adult population, attained a high school degree or less, significantly higher than the rate of the American population at roughly 40%. We're also looking at, despite lower 2 and 4 year degree attainment rates, the US born Latinx adult population actually has a higher percentage of people who have attained a 2-year degree or some college. Also, in terms of civil rights and resistance, the Latinx civil rights movements grew out of the 1900s as parallel to civil rights movements for African Americans, women, and the LGBTQ community. The founding of the League of United Latin American Citizens in 1929 was a significant milestone in such efforts, with the addition of momentum achieved through boycotts, strikes, lawsuits, and the Chicano civil rights movement of the 1960s.